The tape recorder sat on the table in front of him, and for a moment, everything was ordinary. He was 41 years old. He had survived the Shah's prisons. He had watched his mentor return from exile to remake Iran in God's image. He had helped manage a revolution from the inside, while pretending for years to be merely a provincial cleric giving Friday sermons. He had every reason to believe the worst was behind him, and the best was still ahead. The mosque was full. The morning light came through the windows at the angle it always did. Then the tape recorder made a sound. It was a whistle, brief, high-pitched, almost quizzical, and then the world came apart. The explosion tore through the Abu Zar Mosque on June 27, 1981, and when the smoke began to clear, Ali Khamenei was still alive. He would not fully understand the extent of his injuries for some time. The nerves in his right arm had been permanently destroyed. His neck had been struck. His vocal cords were damaged in ways that would never fully heal. When he speaks today, when he delivers the Friday prayers in Tehran that have become the ritual performance of his absolute authority, he speaks softly, not by choice, not as a rhetorical device. The softness of his voice is the sound of a man who walked out of a bombed mosque in 1981 and has been speaking through damaged tissue ever since. A message was found in the wreckage. It read simply, "A gift from the Furqan group." He survived. And then, in ways that nobody in that mosque could have predicted, in ways that defy almost any conventional understanding of how power works, he went on to become one of the most durable authoritarian rulers of the modern world. For more than 3.5 decades, he held supreme authority over a nation of 90 million people. He outlasted the Soviet Union, outlasted a dozen American presidents, outlasted every rival and counterpart from his era. He built a regional empire of proxy forces that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. He pursued nuclear ambitions that kept Western intelligence agencies in a sustained state of controlled panic for 20 years. And then, in the space of roughly 2 years, he watched nearly all of it disintegrate. This is the story of Ali Khamenei, the man who survived everything until now. Before we follow him into what came next, let me tell you about this channel. Every episode here is a complete life, the full arc from the first room to the last decision, told the way life actually works. The ambition and the failure and the moral complexity that makes a human being out of what history sometimes flattens into an icon or a villain. No fluff, no filler, just the full story, told the way it deserves to be. If that's what you're here for, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single episode. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. Your city, your country, wherever you are right now. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. All right, let's go back to the beginning. He was born in Mashhad in the summer of 1939, though even the date is contested. The official record gives July 17th. An alternate record suggests April 19th. The discrepancy is minor in isolation, but it is characteristic of a life whose biographical foundations were laid in a country where record-keeping was unreliable, and where later a man in power has every reason to curate his own origin story. The year itself is not in dispute, 1939. The imperial state of Iran was then ruled by Reza Shah Pahlavi, a former military officer who had seized power in a coup in 1921 and built a modernizing authoritarian state in the image of Ataturk's Turkey. His son, Mohammad Reza, would succeed him in 1941 and rule until the revolution that Khamenei helped bring about nearly 4 decades later. Mashhad was not a peripheral city. It was, and remains, one of the holiest cities in Shia Islam, a shrine city in the northeastern province of Khorasan, built around the tomb of the 8th Imam, Ali ibn Musa al-Ridha, who died there in the 9th century. To grow up in Mashhad was to grow up inside a living argument about the nature of sacred authority, about who had the right to interpret God's will and who did not. That argument would become the central question of Khamenei's life. His father was Javad Khamenei, a Shia cleric of Azeri ethnicity. Azeris form Iran's largest ethnic minority, concentrated in the northwest of the country, and the family name itself derived from the northwestern village of Khamenei in East Azerbaijan, from which the family had come. Javad had studied at the great seminary of Najaf in Iraq, the city that contains the shrine of Ali, the first imam of Shia Islam, and the figure from whom all Shia authority descends, before relocating to Mashhad, where he married, raised a family, and built the kind of local clerical reputation that commands deep respect without ever reaching the highest ranks of the scholarly hierarchy. The household was modest by any measure. Khamenei's own account of his childhood holds that the family lived in a single room and subsisted primarily on bread, dates, and raisins. Many historians regard this account as somewhat embellished. Yidiniras dans ingredient, a biographical detail that has been amplified over the years to construct a poverty narrative consonant with the Islamic Republic's self-image as a movement of the dispossessed. The austerity appears genuine enough. The family was not destitute, but they were not comfortable, and the gap between the Khamenei household and the households of the Shah's ministers and generals was vast in ways that a young boy growing up in a sacred city would have understood from an early age. His mother, whose name was Khadija Mirdamadi, was educated, notably so for a woman of her time and station, and she personally taught Ali the things that fell outside his father's clerical curriculum: Persian history, art, literature, the poetry and prose of a civilization that stretched back 1,000 years before Islam arrived on the Iranian plateau. This maternal education would leave permanent marks. Khamenei became, in ways that coexisted uneasily with his theocratic authority, a man of genuine literary culture, a translator, a reader of Western fiction, a person who engaged with ideas across traditions, even when he rejected most of what those traditions stood for. He was the second of 8 children. His younger brother Hadi would later sit in the Iranian parliament and join the reform-minded Association of Combatant Clerics, a body that, in the years of Hadi's membership, was specifically arguing for a reduction in the supreme leader's power. That the supreme leader's own brother would one day align himself with forces seeking to curtail that power is one of the quieter ironies in this story. But that comes much later. In Mashhad, in the 1940s and early 50s, the Khamenei children were simply a cleric's family in a sacred city, making do. Ali's formal religious education began in Mashhad under scholars including Ayatollah Sheikh Hashem Kazvani in the mid-1950s. He traveled briefly to Najaf, the city where his father had trained, the burial ground of the first imam, to steep himself in the source of Shia scholarship. Then he returned to Iran and made his way southwest to Qom, the intellectual and spiritual capital of Iranian Shia Islam, the city of seminaries and senior ayatollahs, the city where the religious and political arguments that would eventually remake Iran were being refined and sharpened like weapons in preparation for a war that hadn't started yet. It was in Qom, in 1957, that Ali Khamenei began studying under a cleric whose name would define the century, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was already a formidable figure within the Shia scholarly world, a man of immense personal authority, fierce intellectual conviction, and a burning political vision that most of his colleagues regarded as either prophetic or dangerous, depending on their temperament. He had developed and was refining the doctrine that would one day become the constitutional foundation of the Islamic Republic, the concept known as Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The doctrine held that in the absence of the hidden imam, the 12th imam of Twelver Shia Islam, who is believed to have entered a state of occultation in the 9th century and will one day return, political authority must rest with the most qualified Islamic scholar. In practical terms, this meant that a cleric should govern the state. The doctrine was, and remains, deeply controversial within Shia Islam itself. Many senior scholars rejected it categorically. But in Qom, in the 1950s, under Khomeini's supervision, a generation of young clerics was being formed around it. Khamenei was one of them. He was studious, serious, already marked by the kind of focused intensity that his later years would only deepen. But his time in Qom was cut short, and the circumstances of that interruption would follow him for decades. In 1963, the Shah launched what he called the White Revolution, a top-down modernization program that included land reform, the expansion of women's rights, and a series of economic changes designed to break the power of the traditional landowning class and the clerical establishment that depended on it. The clerics saw it clearly for what it was. Khomeini emerged as the most vocal and uncompromising opponent of the program and was promptly arrested. Protests erupted across Iran in June 1963. Hundreds of people were killed. The government's response was brutal, and the anger it generated was real. But the Shah held. Khomeini, deemed too dangerous to imprison indefinitely and too famous to execute, was sent into exile, first to Turkey, then to the holy city of Najaf in Iraq, and eventually, in the final months of the decade, to a small town outside Paris, from which he would orchestrate the revolution's final chapter. Khomeini left. Khamenei did not follow him. He remained in Iran, in part from conviction and in part from family obligation. His father was aging and partially blind, and Khamenei returned to Mashhad to care for him. This decision had a consequence that is not trivial. By leaving the seminaries of Qom before completing the full curriculum, Khamenei never achieved the senior religious qualification that most scholars regarded as essential to the highest clerical offices. The rank of marja, a supreme religious authority, a source of emulation for ordinary believers making decisions about how to live their lives according to Islamic law, is the pinnacle of Shia clerical achievement. Khomeini held it beyond dispute. Khamenei did not, and the gap in his training was the gap through which critics would later drive a very large truck. He arrived in adulthood as a politically committed, intellectually engaged, personally courageous cleric, but not the most learned man in any room of senior scholars. That fact would matter eventually in the most consequential way possible. In 1964, back in Mashhad, he married Mansoura Khojaste Bagherzadeh. She is one of the least documented major figures in the entire story of the Islamic Republic. No photographs of her circulate publicly. She has given to the knowledge of most historians exactly one interview in her life. In it, she described a conversation she and Khamenei had at the very beginning of their marriage, in which he told her directly that she should expect him to be arrested. Not that it might happen, that it would happen. She said she accepted this as the price of his mission. They went on to have 6 children, 4 sons, Mostafa, Mojtaba, Masoud, and Maisam, and 2 daughters, Hoda and Bashra. Through years of imprisonment, surveillance, forced absences, and sustained political danger, Mansoura maintained the household largely alone. Her deliberate absence from the historical record is almost certainly a matter of choice, a form of self-protection in a regime that has never been reluctant to use a man's family against him. The arrests began almost immediately. Savak, the Shah's feared secret police, trained partly by the CIA and the Israeli Mossad, had Khamenei on its radar early. He was detained multiple times through the 1960s and into the 70s, held for periods ranging from weeks to months. He gave sermons railing against the Shah's regime. He traveled across Iran. He worked. His longest detention came between January and August of 1975, during which he was held largely in solitary confinement. His family was not told where he was. For 7 months, Mansoura and the children did not know if he was alive. In the intervals between arrests, he read. Western authors were not off limits. Khamenei read John Steinbeck, among others. He read Western literature not to admire it, he would later say, but to understand what he was opposing. The distinction mattered to him. To know your enemy's culture was not to approve of it. It was intelligence gathering of a different kind. In 1967, he completed a translation that reveals something important about the intellectual world he inhabited. The text was Sayyid Qutb's The Future in Islamic Lands, a work by an Egyptian member of the Muslim Brotherhood executed by Gamal Abdel Nasser's government in Cairo the previous year. Qutb's writings argued that contemporary Muslim societies had relapsed into pre-Islamic ignorance, and that a revolutionary Islamic vanguard had both the right and the obligation to overthrow the secular order by force. Khamenei's foreword was direct: "The future belongs to Islam." Savak largely suppressed its publication, but the act of translation was itself a declaration of where Khamenei stood in the intellectual landscape of political Islam and of the Arabic language competence that most Iranian clerics lacked. Qutb's ideology was Sunni, Khamenei's Shia, and the doctrinal differences are real. But the shared framework, the conviction that secular governance is an abomination and that revolutionary action against impious authority is required, ran through both traditions. Khamenei was, by the late 1960s, a fully formed revolutionary, theologically trained, politically committed, personally seasoned by imprisonment, and patient in the way that only people who genuinely believe history is on their side can be patient. In 1977, he co-founded the Association of Combatant Clergy, a clerical body explicitly organized to oppose the Shah. By then, the opposition had reached critical mass. The economic contradictions of the Shah's modernization program had generated resentment across class lines. The gap between the westernized elite of northern Tehran and the traditional religious poor of provincial Iran had become a wound that no amount of oil revenue could close. And the Shah's security apparatus, brutal, pervasive, feared, had generated the kind of visceral hatred that turns ordinary people into revolutionaries. Then came the fire. On August 19, 1978, in the southwestern city of Abadan, a cinema called The Rex was set ablaze with the doors barricaded from the outside. More than 400 people burned to death or suffocated. The fire was almost certainly the work of Islamic extremists, not the Shah's government. But in the superheated political atmosphere of 1978, with the revolution weeks away from success, it was blamed on the Shah. The outrage it generated was enormous. Within weeks, the Shah's position had become untenable. He was ill, cancer, it would later emerge, and his health was visibly failing alongside his authority. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi left Iran, ostensibly for medical treatment. He never returned. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's plane landed at Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran. The crowds that had gathered to greet him were, by most estimates, among the largest in recorded history. 10 days later, the Islamic Republic of Iran was declared. The revolution was complete. Khomeini had waited 20 years for this moment. He had been arrested, surveilled, separated from his family, held in silence in a cell while his children did not know if he was coming home. He had translated revolutionary texts and given inflammatory sermons and helped build the organizational architecture of a movement that had just, against all reasonable historical expectation, actually won. He was 39 years old. His teacher was now the supreme leader of a nation of 35 million people. And Khamenei himself, though nobody outside a very small circle knew it yet, had been operating at the center of the transition all along. It was revealed only in 1980 that Khamenei had been a member of the secret 13-man Islamic Revolutionary Council, the body charged with managing the transfer of power from the Shah's government to the new Islamic Republic. He had also been involved in establishing the Islamic Republican Party, which would dominate Iranian politics through the 1980s, and had been given a senior role in purging the Iranian army and security services of officers whose loyalties remained with the old regime. This was not peripheral work. This was the reconstruction of a state's coercive apparatus from the inside out. But the new republic was fragile. The coalition that had united to overthrow the Shah, Shia clerics, moderate Islamists, secular liberals, leftists with Soviet sympathies, began fracturing almost immediately after victory. The question of what kind of Iran the revolution had produced was genuinely contested. By December 1979, with the Constitution ratified and Khomeini's Velayat-e-Faqih doctrine enshrined as the Republic's founding principle, it was clear that the clerics had won the argument. But winning the argument and securing the peace were different challenges. The violence that followed was sustained and multidirectional. The Forkin group that would place a bomb in front of Khamenei had been founded in the mid-70s by a man named Akbar Gudardzi, drawing ideological sustenance from the writings of Ali Shariati, an Iranian intellectual who had blended Shia theology with anti-colonial leftism. The Furqan group was not opposed to Islam. It was opposed to the clericalization of the state. Before the Abu Zar Mosque, they had already assassinated the first post-revolutionary chief of staff of the Iranian army, the head of the Supreme Court, and the deputy prime minister. They were dismantled eventually by the Revolutionary Guard. But in the chaotic first years of the Republic, they were a genuine threat to its senior figures. The blast in the mosque on that June morning was not the only shock to the system in those weeks. 6 days before the bombing, the Islamic Republic's first president, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, had been impeached by the Majlis at Khomeini's instigation, removed because he had pursued an insufficiently Islamic line, because he had tried to build a more pluralistic political system than Khomeini was prepared to tolerate. Then, on August 30th, 1981, just 2 months after Khamenei survived the bombing, the second president, Mohammad Ali Rajai, was assassinated after barely a month in office, in a bombing widely attributed to the People's Mujahideen, the leftist Islamist group that had become one of the Republic's most dangerous enemies. 2 presidents in rapid succession. A bomb that nearly killed one of the Republic's senior figures. Fresh elections called for October 2nd, 1981. And Khamenei, still not fully recovered from his injuries, his right arm permanently paralyzed, his voice permanently softened by the damage to his vocal cords. Khamenei put his name on the ballot. He won in a landslide. He became the 3rd president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Iran he now presided over as president was a country at war, and had been since September 1980. Saddam Hussein had launched the invasion expecting a swift campaign against what he believed was a militarily disorganized, ideologically distracted post-revolutionary state. He expected to be in Tehran within weeks. He expected the Arab population of Iran's southwestern Khuzestan province to rise up and welcome him as a liberator. He was wrong on every count. Already, the Iranian army, despite its post-revolutionary purges, was motivated by something Saddam's professional military could not easily match, a genuine belief that it was fighting for God and the revolution. The Iraqi advance was stopped, then reversed. Then the war ground on and on and on for 8 years. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 1 million people died, soldiers and civilians on both sides, in battles fought with artillery, tanks, and, in the most grotesque chapter of the conflict, chemical weapons that Saddam Hussein deployed against both Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians in northern Iraq. The United States, viewing Saddam as a counterweight to Iranian revolutionary influence, quietly provided him with intelligence and material support through much of the conflict. This fact has never been forgotten in Tehran. The depth of Iranian hostility toward American foreign policy cannot be understood without it. Khamenei, as wartime president, visited the front on several occasions. He managed the war's political dimensions from Tehran. And here, in one of the most revealing moments of his early career, the pragmatic side of his character surfaced in a way that contradicted the image of ideological rigidity he would later project. When Saddam Hussein, shocked by the failure of his campaign and facing Iranian forces pressing deep into Iraqi territory, sued for a ceasefire in 1982, Khamenei reportedly favored accepting it. The logic was sound. Iran had repelled the invasion, demonstrated the revolution's military resilience, and could now consolidate. The war had served its defensive purpose. He was overruled. Khomeini and the hardliners wanted more. They believed the war could be weaponized as a vehicle to export the revolution, that the Shia majority of Iraq could be ignited by the example of Iran, and that a revolutionary Islamic government in Baghdad would transform the regional balance of power. The war continued for 6 more years. By the time Iran finally accepted a United Nations brokered ceasefire in August 1988, Khomeini described the decision as drinking from a poisoned chalice. The revolutionary dream of exporting the republic to Iraq had failed. The dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands on the Iranian side alone. The strategic calculation had been catastrophically wrong. Khamenei served 2 terms as president, winning re-election in 1985 with 87% of the vote. Through this period, he was not merely an administrator. He was building relationships with the Revolutionary Guard's officers, with the clerical establishment, with the machinery of the state. He was learning the architecture of Iranian power from the inside. And by the mid-1980s, as Khomeini's health became an increasingly open concern within the establishment, that architecture was going to matter more than anyone could comfortably acknowledge. Khomeini suffered a heart attack in 1986. The succession discussions that followed were conducted with the extreme discretion demanded by a system that had invested all of its legitimacy in a single figure. To plan publicly for succession was to acknowledge that the figure was mortal, which was to introduce a kind of doubt the regime could not afford. So the discussions were private, anxious, and ultimately unresolved. Khomeini recovered, but everyone now understood that recovery had a limit. On June 3, 1989, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei died. He was approaching 90. The man who had remade Iran, who had taken a country of 35 million people and placed it under the governance of God, as interpreted by his own extraordinary will, was gone. The Assembly of Experts convened the very next day. The Assembly of Experts is the body charged under the Iranian constitution with selecting and theoretically overseeing the supreme leader. In 1989, it was composed of senior clerics who understood, with clarity that did not require lengthy deliberation, the enormity of the moment. Khomeini had been irreplaceable by definition. No one commanded his combination of supreme religious scholarship, revolutionary charisma, and absolute personal authority. The succession was going to be a diminishment no matter who was chosen. Several names were in circulation. The most obvious candidate in terms of religious qualification was Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, who had been Khomeini's designated successor for several years before a political falling out led to his exclusion from consideration. An unverified claim circulated in the assembly that Khomeini had, in private conversations in his final weeks, expressed a wish for Khamenei to follow him. The claim could not be confirmed. It was not, in any formal sense, evidence. But it circulated, and it mattered, and in the politics of succession it was exactly the kind of thing that could tip a vote. Khamenei was elected second supreme leader of Iran by 60 votes to 14. He was 50 years old. There was a problem that everyone in that room understood, and no one wanted to address directly. Khamenei had not completed his full religious training. He did not hold the rank of Marja. He was not, in the view of many senior Shia scholars, including some in that very assembly, qualified by the traditional standards of Islamic jurisprudence to occupy the highest religious office in the Islamic Republic. The solution the assembly reached was swift and surgical. The Iranian constitution was amended on the same day or within days to remove the requirement that the supreme leader hold the rank of Marja. The position was rewritten to fit the man. He would hold the title of Ayatollah without the scholarly standing that most Shia clerics associated with it. He would govern in the name of Islamic jurisprudence without the unimpeachable jurisprudential credentials that Khomeini had possessed. The man who survived everything had just been handed the most powerful position in Iran. And the legitimacy question, the qualification gap, the amended constitution, the unverifiable deathbed wish, would live in the background of his rule from that day forward, never fully resolved, never entirely silenced. What he did with the years that followed was methodical, patient, and thorough. The consolidation of power under Khamenei did not announce itself. It accumulated. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Seva, as Iranians call it, was Khomeini's most important instrument. Founded by Khomeini in May 1979 as a kind of parallel military force, ideologically committed to the revolution in ways that the regular army, with its professional officer corps and secular traditions, could not be, the Guard Corps had always been a personal army for the supreme leader rather than a national army for the state. Khamenei understood this from the beginning. He expanded it dramatically. He micromanaged its command structure with a personal attention that was, by the accounts of those who observed it, extraordinary. Senior commanders and mid-level officers were hand-picked loyalists. State resources flowed into the organization's budget, its equipment, its training, its networks of influence. Today, the Guard Corps has approximately 125,000 members and tentacles in every significant sector of Iranian life. In 1992, Khomeini created the Police Command of the Islamic Republic, an umbrella security organization that brought together the various law enforcement functions of the state under a single structure and which now employs more than 250,000 people. In the summer of 2005, he created the Guidance Patrol, the so-called morality police, known in Farsi as Gasht-e-Ershad, which reported directly to him and enforced Sharia law in the streets, with particular attention to female dress codes. The morality police were not a peripheral force. They were, from their creation, an expression of the supreme leader's direct reach into the daily lives of Iranian women. The strategy Khamenei pursued from the earliest years of his rule was one of strategic depth through proxy forces, building networks of armed groups and political movements across the Middle East that would extend Iranian influence far beyond the country's borders, without requiring the deployment of Iranian soldiers. This architecture his officials would later call the axis of resistance. Hezbollah was the crown jewel. The organization had been constituted in 1982, in the southern Lebanese chaos following the Israeli invasion of that year, with Iran's Revolutionary Guard providing training, weapons, and funding from the start. Under Khamenei, that investment deepened dramatically. In 1992, he sanctioned Hezbollah's participation in Lebanese parliamentary elections, transforming the organization from a purely military force into a hybrid entity with democratic legitimacy and seats in parliament. Hezbollah's annual budget at its peak was estimated at between several hundred million and over $1 billion annually, the overwhelming majority from Iran. The organization built schools, hospitals, reconstruction programs, giving it genuine popular support in the Shia communities of southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. It developed precision missile capabilities and a tunnel network of extraordinary complexity across southern Lebanon. When it fought the Israeli Defense Forces to a strategic draw for 34 days in the summer of 2006, the Arab world celebrated. Khamenei's proxy strategy had produced something that no Arab state army had managed, a sustained military engagement with Israel that Israel had not won. Hamas was a different and more ideologically complicated investment. Founded in 1987 as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas was Sunni, and the sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia Islam is not trivial. Yet Khamenei backed Hamas consistently, as did Qatar. The shared objective, the elimination of Israel as a political entity, and the resistance to American influence in the Middle East proved more powerful than the theological disagreements. Money, weapons, and training flowed to Gaza. In Yemen, from at least 2009, Iran was supplying the Houthi movement, a Shia militia that had been fighting a grinding insurgency against the Yemeni government and its Saudi backers. When the Yemeni civil war erupted in earnest in 2014, Khomeini backed the Houthis. The result was a proxy conflict between Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia that devastated Yemen, and that also, by the early 2020s, had given the Houthis sufficient military capability to disrupt Red Sea shipping with drone and missile attacks, a capability that would become dramatically relevant in the context of the war that erupted in October 2023. In Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, a network of Shia militias that had coalesced in 2014 in response to the advance of the Islamic State, were substantially funded, trained, and politically influenced by Iran. Several of the most powerful PMF groups were, in practice, closer to Tehran than to Baghdad. Iran had cultivated influence in the Shia communities of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia's eastern province. In Syria, Khamenei backed the Assad government through the civil war that began in 2011, deploying Revolutionary Guard officers and Hezbollah fighters to prevent Assad's collapse and maintain Iran's land corridor to Lebanon. The corridor mattered because it was the supply route through which weapons reached Hezbollah. The nuclear program ran in parallel to all of this. It had begun under the Shah in 1957 through the Atoms for Peace initiative that the Eisenhower administration had promoted as a form of Cold War soft power. The Shah's government received enriched uranium from the United States in 1967 and planned to build 23 nuclear power plants by 1994. The revolution disrupted that timeline but did not end the program. Under Khamenei, with Russian technical expertise and a Chinese-supplied fusion reactor delivered in 1993, nuclear facilities were developed at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The regime consistently maintained that the program was for civilian purposes. This claim was rendered difficult to credit by two facts. Iran sits atop approximately 9% of the world's proven oil reserves and 17% of its proven natural gas reserves, making the case for civilian nuclear energy weak on its face, and the country accepted decades of crippling economic sanctions rather than accept the international community's demands for transparency, which is not the behavior of a government that has nothing to hide. At home, the political picture was always more complicated than Khamenei's international adversaries sometimes acknowledged. When the reformist cleric Mohammad Khatami won the presidential election of 1997 on a platform of liberalization, press freedom, and dialogue with the West, Khamenei did not block him. He permitted the election, he permitted initially the new political opening, but he was also watching carefully where the opening led. In July 1999, the government closed the newspaper Salam, a reformist paper that had been pushing the boundaries of what the Islamic Republic's press laws permitted. Students in Tehran erupted in the largest protests since the revolution. Over 1,000 were arrested. The protests were suppressed. Khatami continued his presidency, but found year by year that the space available to him was shrinking. The Guardian Council, the constitutional body appointed in part by the supreme leader, that reviews all legislation for Islamic compliance and vets all candidates for elected office, became Khamenei's primary instrument for constraining the reform movement. By 2004, the council had moved decisively, barring large numbers of reformist candidates from standing in parliamentary elections. The reform era ended not with a confrontation, but with a bureaucratic strangulation. Khatami served out his terms. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a hardliner, won the 2005 presidential election. In 2009, the contradiction at the heart of the Islamic Republic's political system became impossible to ignore. Ahmadinejad was re-elected with 63% of the vote against the reformist candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi. The result was announced within hours of the polls closing, suspiciously quickly for an election of that scale and complexity. The opposition and independent observers believed the result had been rigged. Millions of Iranians in dozens of cities took to the streets, wearing the green color of Mousavi's campaign in what became known as the Green Movement. Khamenei's response was rapid and unambiguous. He declared the election result valid. He ordered mass arrests. Internet access was restricted. Universities were closed. Rallies were banned. The Revolutionary Guard and the Basij, the volunteer paramilitary force affiliated with the Guard, dispersed crowds with batons, tear gas, and in some cases, live fire. Hundreds were arrested. Dozens were killed. Mousavi and his wife, the artist and academic Zahra Rahnavard, along with the former parliamentary speaker Mehdi Karoubi, were placed under house arrest in 2011, where Mousavi and Rahnavard remained for over a decade. The Green Movement was broken. The people who had voted for change were told clearly and without much ambiguity that their votes did not override the supreme leader's judgment. I have to pause here for a moment because think about what that means for the millions of ordinary Iranians who marched in 2009. They went into the streets believing that the system could be changed from within, that elections meant something, that the Republic in Islamic Republic was more than a formality. And then they watched the man they voted for disappear into house arrest for 10 years, while the man who stole the election stayed in power with the supreme leader's explicit blessing. If you had been one of those millions, what do you think you would have done next? Stayed in the system? Walked away from it entirely? Radicalized? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what those millions chose to do, or not do, shaped Iran for the next 15 years. Here's what Khamenei did next. When the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East and North Africa, beginning in late 2010, Khamenei initially described the uprisings as an Islamic awakening, movements inspired by the Iranian Revolution that were now spreading to other Muslim societies. The framing was self-serving, but not entirely dishonest. In several countries, Islamist parties did benefit from the upheaval. But when the wave reached Tehran on February 14, 2011, and protesters took to the streets in solidarity with the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, Khamenei's response was instant and brutal. The Revolutionary Guard was deployed. Other security units were mobilized. Reports emerged, denied by the Iranian government credible to independent observers, that Hezbollah units from Lebanon were present in Tehran to assist with the crackdown. The Arab Spring never found its footing in Iran. The green shoots of protest were stamped out within days. Through all of this, the IRGC's economic empire was expanding alongside its military and political roles. The Guard Corps controlled between 20 and 40% of the formal Iranian economy. Construction companies, telecommunications networks, energy infrastructure, financial institutions, smuggling networks built in response to sanctions. It was simultaneously Khamenei's political enforcer, his regional military instrument, his domestic surveillance apparatus, and one of the largest economic actors in the country. This dual function, ideological guardian and material oligarch, made it the most powerful institution in Iran below the supreme leader himself, and a structural obstacle to any reform that might threaten its reach. The people who paid the price for this were ordinary Iranians, young people with education and ambition watching opportunity drain away, women navigating the daily indignity of the morality police, working-class families whose wages could not keep pace with prices in a sanctions-battered economy that should, by any rational measure of its oil and gas reserves, be among the most prosperous in the region. These were not statistics. They were the human cost of a system that had chosen geopolitical ambition and ideological purity over the welfare of its own citizens. The 2015 nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, represented the closest the international community came to a diplomatic resolution of the nuclear question. Iran accepted specific limits on its uranium enrichment in exchange for meaningful sanctions relief. The IAEA assessed Iran was complying. Then, on May 8, 2018, President Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from the agreement and reimposed sanctions. Iran, which had been complying with its obligations, now faced the full weight of American economic pressure again without a negotiated framework. From Tehran's perspective, the lesson was unambiguous. Diplomacy with the United States was unreliable, and the only real deterrent was the one thing the deal had sought to prevent. Iran returned to aggressive uranium enrichment. By the early 2020s, Western intelligence agencies assessed Iran's nuclear breakout capacity, the time to produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium for a single device, at under 2 weeks. In September 2022, a 22-year-old woman named Mahsa Amini, known to her family and friends by her Kurdish name, Gina, was arrested by the guidance patrol, the morality police that Khamenei had created in 2005, for an alleged violation of the headscarf regulations. She fell into a coma while in custody. She died on September 16, 2022. The cause of her death, whether she was beaten or whether she died from a pre-existing condition, as the government claimed, was disputed. The meaning of her death was not. The protests that erupted across Iran in the weeks and months that followed were unlike anything Khamenei had faced before. Under the slogan, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom, they were led primarily by young women who burned their headscarves in the street, who cut their hair publicly as acts of defiance, who stood in front of armed security forces and refused to move. The movement was not asking for modifications to the Islamic Republic's policies. It was challenging the Islamic Republic's right to exist. Evin Prison, Tehran's most notorious detention facility, became a symbol of the regime's response. A site of mass incarceration, documented torture, and, in a number of cases, execution. The slogan, "Women, Life, Freedom," entered the global lexicon of feminist resistance. But the protests, like the Green Movement before them, were ultimately suppressed. The machinery of control held. The arrests, the executions, the international isolation of participants, it was enough. The regime survived. Yet, something had changed. The depth of alienation that the Mahsa Amini protests revealed, the breadth of them, the fearlessness of them, the fact that they were led by the generation that had grown up entirely within the Islamic Republic and had never known anything else, was not a problem that could be solved by arrests alone. These were not people who had been infected by foreign influence. They were people who had been formed by the Islamic Republic and had decided, in their millions, that they rejected it. Meanwhile, the geopolitical gamble was accelerating toward its final phase. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a coordinated series of incursions from the Gaza Strip into Israel. The scale of the assault was unlike anything that had occurred in the region in decades. Nearly 1,200 people were killed, most of them civilians. 251 were taken hostage into Gaza. The atrocities committed during the incursions, documented and undeniable, shocked the world. Israel's response was total. The military campaign that followed, unprecedented in its intensity, destroyed most of Gaza's infrastructure and resulted in catastrophic civilian casualties on the Palestinian side. In the weeks and months that followed, the axis of resistance activated. Hezbollah began firing rockets and anti-tank missiles into northern Israel, forcing the evacuation of dozens of Israeli communities along the border. The Houthis in Yemen launched drone and missile attacks against Israeli territory and began disrupting commercial shipping in the Red Sea, a campaign that affected global trade flows and that Khamenei's decades of investment had now made possible. Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq and Syria fired on American military positions. The Axis was, for a brief moment, performing exactly the coordinated regional pressure role for which it had been designed, and then Israel began systematically dismantling it. The operation that the Israeli intelligence services conducted against Hezbollah's communications infrastructure in September 2024 was one of the most audacious in the history of modern intelligence work. Thousands of pager devices used by Hezbollah operatives were intercepted somewhere in their supply chain and fitted with small explosive charges. On September 17, 2024, the devices were remotely detonated simultaneously across Lebanon. The following day, walkie-talkie devices, also compromised, exploded. In 2 days, thousands of Hezbollah fighters and operatives were killed or wounded. The organization's command structure was exposed, its communications security shattered, its supply chain revealed as deeply penetrated. The psychological impact was enormous. What followed was a bombing campaign against Beirut and southern Lebanon that decapitated Hezbollah's senior leadership. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah for more than 3 decades, the face of the organization, the man whose relationship with Khamenei had made him one of the most powerful non-state actors in the Middle East, was killed in an Israeli airstrike on Beirut on September 27, 2024. He had led Hezbollah since 1992. His death was not the end of the organization, but it was the end of its era. Direct exchanges between Iran and Israel, the unprecedented escalation that both countries had avoided for decades through the filter of proxies, occurred in April, July, and October of 2024. Iran fired ballistic missiles and drones at Israel. Israel fired back. The exchanges were significant, not just for their military dimensions, but for what they represented. The proxy layer had thinned to the point of transparency. The confrontation between Iran and Israel, long conducted through intermediaries, was now increasingly direct. And then came June 13th, 2025. If you've stayed with this story this long, and you have, because here we are, thank you. Genuinely. These are the lives that define the world we live in, and this channel exists to tell them fully, with all the complexity and contradiction they deserve. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is exactly the moment. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and stay with us, because there are more stories coming that you won't want to miss. But first, there's one final chapter, and it may be the most consequential one of all. So tell me this before we get there. What do you think? Was this a man of extraordinary conviction or extraordinary delusion? Was the axis of resistance a genuine strategic achievement, or a 35-year performance of regional power that was always more fragile than it appeared? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Now, June 13th, 2025, Israel launched coordinated precision strikes on Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. The operation was not a single bombing run. It was a sustained, layered attack, multiple waves against multiple targets, designed to achieve in hours what decades of diplomacy and sanctions had failed to achieve. The targets included the nuclear enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordo that had been at the center of the international standoff for 20 years, military command centers, weapon storage sites, and, with the precision that had characterized Israel's operations throughout the preceding months, specific individuals. Senior military officers with decades of service were killed. Nuclear scientists were killed. Politicians were killed. The Iranian military and scientific establishment, already diminished by a year of targeted assassinations and intelligence penetrations, absorbed blows it had not anticipated at this scale. Ali Khamenei went into hiding. The man who had survived the bomb in the Abu Zar Mosque in 1981, who had built an empire of proxies, and a nuclear program, and a domestic surveillance apparatus, and a regional strategy that had consumed 35 years and untold billions. That man was now in a secure location, relaying instructions about the succession to the people around him, in case the next Israeli strike found him. Days after the Israeli attacks, the United States conducted its own bombing of Iranian nuclear sites. The two allies, not formally coordinated on the public record, but operating with obvious strategic alignment, had between them destroyed much of what Khamenei had spent his rule building. The proxy network, Hezbollah, crippled. Hamas's military leadership decimated. The Houthis degraded. The Iranian land corridor to Lebanon through Syria disrupted. The axis of resistance, the architecture of Khamenei's regional strategy, had been reduced from a coherent network to a collection of battered remnants in the space of roughly 2 years. The nuclear program, the facilities that had been the source of international anxiety for 2 decades, the facilities that Iran had accepted crippling economic sanctions to protect, the facilities that Khamenei had guarded as the ultimate guarantee of the regime's survival and the ultimate expression of its defiance. Struck by Israeli and American bombs, their infrastructure damaged in ways that would take years to rebuild, if rebuilding was even possible. The man who had survived everything was alive, but what he had built was in significant measure rubble. Consider the distance traveled from that one-room house in Mashhad, a boy born in 1939 in a shrine city, in a household where austerity was not an aesthetic choice, but a material reality. A father who was a respected local scholar, not a grand Ayatollah. A mother who taught him Persian poetry because she understood that a civilization's literature is a form of armor. An education interrupted by family obligation, leaving gaps critics would exploit for decades. A marriage to a woman who knew, from the first conversation, that she was marrying a man who would be imprisoned. Years in solitary confinement. A bomb that destroyed the use of his right arm and gave him the soft voice that would become the auditory signature of supreme power for 35 years. And then, against all reasonable expectation, the leadership of a nation, not as anyone's obvious choice, but as a compromise candidate who outlasted the doubts about his qualifications through duration and ruthlessness. His legacy is not simple. It cannot be reduced to villainy because the record does not support that reduction. Under Khamenei, Iran's GDP grew substantially in the 1990s and early 2000s. The proxy strategy was genuinely effective for several decades. Hezbollah's performance in the 2006 Lebanon War was, by any military assessment, remarkable. The nuclear program was a real deterrent that shaped Western policy for 20 years. The alliance with China and Russia gave Iran genuine geopolitical cover. And yet, the same rule brought decades of authoritarian repression that consigned millions of Iranians, particularly women, to lives of constrained freedom. It brought rigged elections and house arrests and Evin prison and executions. It brought the morality police and the death of Mahsa Amini and headscarves burning in the street. It brought an economy that should be among the most prosperous in the Middle East, reduced instead to a sanctions-battered state where ordinary families struggle while the Guard Corps extracts rents from every significant sector of the economy. It produced a generation of educated young Iranians who look at what their country could be and choose to leave. His son, Moshtaba, who holds no official position but is widely reported to be deeply influential within the IRGC, and sometimes mentioned as a potential successor, hovers over what comes next. If Moshtaba succeeds his father, the Islamic Republic will have completed, in 2 generations, a dynastic transfer of power indistinguishable in structure from the monarchy the revolution of 1979 overthrew. The doctrine of Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, the constitutional foundation of the entire system, is itself in crisis. It was controversial within Shia Islam from the beginning. The events of 2022 through 2025 have deepened that crisis. A system claiming authority from God, unable to protect its citizens' security, provide economic prosperity, prevent its nuclear facilities from being bombed, or stop a generation of young women from burning the most visible symbol of its authority in the street. That system has a problem that doctrine alone cannot solve. The question that now hangs over Iran is not whether Khamenei's era will end. It must end. He is in his mid-80s, reportedly in poor health, and the pressures bearing down on his position are unlike anything he has faced before. The question is what comes after, whether the reform movement he dismantled in the 2000s will find new expression, whether the IRGC will be a force for continuation or change, whether the next leader will govern a country still defined by Khomeini's doctrine and Khamenei's 35 years of application, or whether the crises of 2022 through 2025 have cracked the system open in ways that cannot be sealed. Again, that is the most consequential open question in the contemporary Middle East. Ali Khamenei survived the bomb in the Abu Zar Mosque. He survived the loss of 2 presidents in rapid succession and became the 3rd. He survived the Iran-Iraq War and 8 years of wartime presidency. He survived the doubt about his qualifications and rewrote the Constitution to make the doubt irrelevant. He survived the Green Movement and the Arab Spring and the women, life, freedom protests, and decades of international sanctions and the collapse of the nuclear deal and the loss of Nasrallah and the pager attack and the bombing of Gaza and the direct missile exchanges with Israel. He has survived more than almost any leader of his era. But in Mashhad, in the shrine city where the 8th Imam is buried, and where a boy grew up in a one-room house learning Persian poetry from his mother, there is a saying common to Shia tradition, that every era has its end, and the end does not ask permission. The man who survived everything is watching, from wherever he is hiding, the things he built not survive him. The softness of his voice, earned on a June morning in 1981 in a mosque in Tehran, when a tape recorder made a sound and the world came apart, is still there. It will be there until it isn't. And what comes after the silence is the question that nobody yet can answer.